You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with Dara Masico and Mike Kaufman of the Carnegie Endowment, and we spoke about the tumult of diplomacy over Ukraine and what's happening on the battlefield. This episode is brought to you by Legion. Every defense professional knows that AI is critical for maintaining a competitive advantage. But most solutions compromise operational security the moment you plug them in. Legion changes that. They build secure agentic AI for the nation's most sensitive environments, on-premises, air-gapped, or in GovCloud. And their platform never trains on your data. Trusted by the Defense Department and the Department of Energy, Legion helps agencies work smarter with AI for search, content creation, and workflow automation up through IL6 classified environments. You can learn more at warontherocks.com/Legion. Enjoy the show. So a lot's happened since Putin walked onto the president's red carpet in Alaska. Let's briefly go through what the main outcomes of Alaska were, briefly, because I'm sure most of our listeners read the news. And then let's talk about what happened in Washington when Zelensky and several European leaders arrived as well. Dara, you want to walk us through briefly what the big outcomes were and what you think it meant?
Yeah, and looking at both events in concert, I would say that the main issues that came out of the summit in D.C. this week were European security guarantees, or at least the discussion of how to formulate that, an agreement on a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky, although there's some question marks from the Russian side, and then following that, if it happens, a trilat. So I think the most tangible outcome from this is waiting to see what the Europeans are going to put together for security guarantees for Ukraine. And it seems like the United States is not going to have a prominent role on the ground.
It seems like a lot of this hinges on interpretations and misinterpretations. But Mike, I know you have a pretty pessimistic view on what this all meant, especially Alaska.
So, I think my view is kind of balanced. On the one hand, Putin, in the span of a few hours, seems to have undone, at least for a while, a lot of Lindsey Graham's work. So we went from an ultimatum and the deadline for a ceasefire that kept shifting. And last time, Ryan, you and I spoke, and I was quite skeptical that this deadline...
that it would ever happen,
That would ever happen. And it didn't so far. And Trump seems to have shifted from what was the Ukrainian-European position, that is ceasefire first, or else he will employ measures to compel Russia towards a ceasefire, and then start negotiating the peace after that, once there is a ceasefire in place, to what had been the Russian framework for negotiations, which is settlement and concessions first, then ceasefire, without any measures being, imposed to compel Russia. So that to me was a bit disappointing. And the deadline for the ultimatum, as best I can tell, has disappeared. Well, not forever. I'm sure Trump might get back to it, but certainly for a while. Putin's bought himself a bunch more time. On the positive side, once Europeans showed up a few days later to try to both undo some of the damage that was done and then leverage parts of the Alaska summit, at least a security guarantee discussion, and turn that into an opportunity, there I see more promising developments, because they are clearly trying to take security guarantees and then turn them into something, because that was always the missing part of the deal for Ukraine. As I used to argue on this podcast, that Ukraine had always wanted two negotiations. The first one was with the United States and Europeans on security guarantees and what we would get to ensure peace. And the second one was with Russia on the actual ceasefire or peace agreement.
Looking back at Alaska in particular, there were really no specifics that came out of that from the Russian side. And I don't know if those are being retained inside diplomatic channels, but I think there may have been some misconceptions. The Russians are very skilled at using fancy-sounding words that mean and signify nothing. Since the summit, we've seen the Russians, different parts of it, like Lavrov or some of the spokesmen, throw cold water on a lot of things that were discussed. For example, you have these elements in the Russian hierarchy who are saying, no, we're not going to do a Putin-Zelensky meeting, but we'll elevate the level of the delegation, which is...
Or you can come to Moscow.
Yeah, or you can come to Moscow, which is a non-starter. So these are very intricate Russian ways of blowing off that suggestion. So they're not interested in moving with any kind of haste on this. They continue to reiterate their line of any Western military presence in Ukraine is unacceptable. So despite this good feeling and this camaraderie that we saw in the summit, the news out of Russia is what we would expect. They're just not really buying into it.
I think this issue of security guarantees and how it was maybe meant and interpreted by both sides is interesting. And so I think the US and Europe interpreted it one way, is that there would be security guarantees that are Article 5 style. That's how Witkoff, at least, reported it. And in the Russian view, it seems like they meant it more in like more of a Budapest memorandum style, where we can waltz in and there's no consequences because we're guaranteeing their territorial integrity like we did before, and they're locked into our sphere in some way. So it's just misunderstanding or maybe miscommunication after miscommunication, intentional or not.
So the security guarantee discussion, I think, right now is a bit of a hot potato because Europeans, I think, understand fully that whatever Putin said to Trump about being open to security guarantees is very clearly not the interpretation that I and others would prefer, right? But they don't care. They're going to try to shape his thinking on it in a specific direction. The Russians had suggest security guarantees in Istanbul. Their framework was something like a set of grantor states, as you said, along the lines of Budapest Memorandum. And they also wanted veto power over any future potential intervention response. They envisioned themselves being one of the guarantor states, which is pretty funny at this point to even suggest. But the Article 5 style discussion, I don't even know what that means, because whenever people say Article 5 style, I always think of cans that say home-style cooking on them, and I suspect the product's going to vary considerably from what it's referring to. So when people say Article 5 style, as best I can tell, they're thinking of some kind of coalition of states that would issue some kind of security commitment to Ukraine. Keep in mind, Article 5 is actually very vague. It obligates states to do something without stating anything specifically that they should do.
Well, to consider attack on one and attack on all, but the actual response is then...
Right. And so what I saw in the discussion was that the U.S. position, as Trump had stated, is that the U.S. would help coordinate this and support this, which is already a significant shift from the previous positions, but no U.S. boots on the ground. However, what Europeans were looking for is movement from the United States on providing a backstop. This is what Starmer wanted months ago, but he couldn't get. So that's an important development from the summit. It's not clear what the European conception is. The way Rutte put it out, Secretary General, NATO, was essentially some boots on the ground. Although it's very clear from Europeans that they don't actually have a lot to offer in the way of force presence. That's increasingly become obvious to me the last couple of months. Some air defense provided to Ukraine, but that's already a package that they seem to have agreed to with Trump, so it feels to me like they're baking in the Patriot batteries they agreed to provide at the NATO summit this summer. Arms for Ukraine, which they also agreed to, and they would finance this, and then the United States would provide arms with Europeans essentially paying for it, right? And then maybe some degree of U.S. involvement and support, but it's not clear what that would be yet. But we increasingly starting to see movement on the security guarantee discussion, which to me is the most positive thing that happened in the last week.
I don't know if it's movement, but let's talk about this idea of territorial exchange or giving up territory. This is another evolution from the president. So before the summit, he was saying Ukraine probably should give up territory. And then in the immediate lead up to the summit, he had walked back from that, saying that's actually up to Ukraine. And then at the summit and after the summit, after he talked to Putin, he said, actually, yeah, there should be some sort of territorial exchange. And then now he seems to have been walked back from that again after his meeting with the Europeans. But this isn't really a simple issue. And I'd like to hear your view on this and what this means politically, but also militarily as it relates to the battlefield.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway from this is it a case where the president can be swayed by the last persuasive argument that he's heard? And what should we take away from this day to day, or do we look at a longer average time period? How is the view shifting on this over the month, summer, the year? As for what it means, there's a lot of focus in particular, I think, in the debate out there on the Donetsk region in particular. And this is that Putin has said that it's his expectation or that Ukraine should give all this territory up to the political administrative boundary of that region. And Russia controls a majority of it. The posters that we've seen at the White House stating that the Russians control around 74%, I think was on the map, is fairly accurate. I also see a bit in the conversation about what the fortress belt in that region means. And this is things like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and a few other cities in that region that have been built up over the last 10 years. If Ukraine was to give them up, it would be a huge loss. If Russia had...
For its defensive fortifications.
They would be giving up all of that. And if the Russians had all of Donetsk, that they would position them in the future to move better or more easily up in Kharkiv or in other directions. And I think that there's some truth in the debate, but I would just like to point out that the Russians never really intended to fight through that defensive belt anyway, even at the beginning of the war. They tried to encircle it from the north, and they got as far down as Izium. That's the part that they had to, the Ukrainians got behind their lines and everything broke apart in 2022. But they were clearly trying to go around that defensive belt, and they're trying to work towards that goal now. From the south, all the activity that we're seeing from Pokrovsk, and they keep trying, but they're not moving very quickly from that northern pincer as well. It would be a blow for Ukraine, but I just don't want that defensive belt to become this weird, like Maginot line in the debate, because the Russians have always tried to go around that.
Yeah, it's not the center of gravity.
I mean, it's good. It's
operationally important.
It's operationally important. It's a hub for them to operate out of. The Russians have been targeting it for a long time, and losing it would be bad. But I just want to point out the Russians aren't planning to fight through it.
I'd say what's more significant, and the Ukrainians have made this point too, of course, is that it's the people that are still living there. Right?
and that's really important. I just, from a military perspective, I think over focusing on that defensive belt and how hard it would be for the Russians to go through it. Of course it would. That's why they don't plan on doing it that way.
That's a fair point.
So, my 2 cents. First, on the defensive belt argument, I'm kind of 50-50 on this, I'll be honest. I think the main thing about Donetsk that makes it hard to take is because it's so urban, and there's so many towns and cities in which to anchor a defense. That said, this would be an argument that made a lot of sense in 22 and 23, the way I've seen the fighting going in 24, and especially now in 25. It's much less relevant in terms of defensive terrain, because a lot of the fortifications you see today are simply not occupied, they're not employed in that manner, and the way Ukraine is defending is largely through individual teams that are dispersed at pretty sizable distances between them, and most of the coverage is to engagement zones provided by drones. And you can see even most recently the Russian breach by Dobropilye that Ukraine successfully countered and prevented from developing, but nonetheless showed in the span of a few days Russian forces could potentially advance a decent distance. And what I'm pointing to here is not the failed Russian attempt at a breakthrough, but more importantly that this Donetsk concept to me doesn't ring all that true. However, Donetsk remains very important to Ukraine, and politically, Zelensky cannot give it up. However, whatever you want to call it. I mean, personally, I think it would be much more catastrophic for Ukraine to lose Zaporizhia and then have Russian forces right at the outside of the city of Dnipro, which is one of the principal last remaining industrial heartlands of Ukraine, as opposed to Donetsk. Even though people on the news still claim that Donetsk is a manufacturing hub for Ukraine, even though Russia controls.
Not anymore, yeah.
Yeah, and it was subsidized for a long time, even before this war, and there's basically a lot of coverage that makes me feel like this is still the 1990s. But where I'm going with this is that Donetsk remains politically very important. A lot of lives have been lost to defend it. Ukraine is still holding on to an important part of it. There's still Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And to the best they can, they're going to try to exhaust Russian offensive potential in Donetsk this year and into the next year. So regarding the rest of their territorial swaps, it's clear that Putin's offering the bits of Kharkiv and the small bits of Sumy they have, maybe some other tidbits like Kinburn and Spit that they control, which is important for access to the Dnieper River and its outlet to the Black Sea in a potential trade. But I suspect they might actually even still be willing to walk off of their demand that Ukraine withdraw from the rest of Donetsk as well. That's just my own personal suspicion. Last point. Witkoff is trying to argue that Russia has made very significant concessions at the summit, but no one knows what those are. As best I can tell, those concessions are they're no longer demanding fully the regions that they annex but don't control, which doesn't strike me as a very significant concession. And they are demanding Ukrainian withdrawal from Donetsk and recognition of the annexation of Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk along with that.
But do we know that? So this is a question I'll put to you too. Based on what we've seen the Kremlin actually say, not what Steve Witkoff has said, because I think, and this isn't a personal attack, I don't know Steve Witkoff. I'm not trying to get to know Steve Witkoff. He's not a reliable reporter on whether it's this or Iran, the negotiations, which isn't to say he's lying. I think he just doesn't understand a lot of this stuff. And so if you rely on what Russia's actually said, I'm not sure their positions changed at all on the 4 territories that they claim, on the so-called root causes. I mean, that was a big part of what apparently Putin talked to Trump about in Alaska. And one of the reasons why that summit was so demoralizing, I think, for supporters of Ukraine. How much has actually changed? Putin still insists on the root cause being this sort of quote-unquote Nazi criminal drug-addicted regime in Kyiv that needs to go away. and needs to be under some form of sovereignty that is Ukrainian but cannot exist without Russian overlordship, which is Putin's original historical argument from 2021. And that these territories, since these like false elections that they held, are actually part of Russia now. So I don't know how much has actually changed from Russia's point of view. Maybe it has, and they just haven't said it yet publicly.
It's hard to know because these conversations are happening between very small numbers of people and they're not talking. I tend to listen to when Rubio speaks because he's very well briefed on the details, and I think he's very careful when he speaks. It's not clear to me either what the Russians have actually offered. And again, that might be a function of them not offering anything. It might be a function of that being contained inside a diplomatic channel. But again, I'm a military analyst. I am happy that I look at tanks. Tanks don't lie to me. People do, or people are capable of it. I just look at the ground and what's happening here. And regardless of this diplomatic noise that we've heard for the last month, look at the ground. Nothing is changing. Russian operations are not changing. They're accelerating in Donetsk. There's no change to the drone and missile strike pattern. They're continuing to build out their infrastructure in the south so that they can transport more weapons and troops by rail. I just see these short-term and long-term preparations for the phase 2 of this war. And all of this diplomacy, no matter how well-meaning that it is, the Russians are just doing what they're going to do anyway. And I just don't see, like, what is the stick that's compelling them to stop? Where is that stick?
Going to take a quick break from my conversation with Mike and Dara for a short conversation with Ben Van Roo, the CEO and co-founder of Legion. We spoke about what makes Legion different in terms of its AI and what he thinks about the future of AI.
You are touching a number of different systems to get some type of job done. And again, in the world of intelligence or analysis, you might touch 5 different systems. Where orchestration and AI orchestration sits in between is we say, look, we're going to connect to all those different systems. You're going to ask a question or you're going to set up an agent to do some type of workflow, and it's going to touch those data. It's going to use different models. It's going to use pull from different applications, and then it's going to present it. And so orchestration acts not as a model layer, but it kind of does all of the other things to go from soup to nuts with a workflow. Where Legion comes in is that orchestration can exist organically where you're asking it to go and do certain things. But we've also built a really intelligent agentic workflow system where you can set up agents. So think of your little AI action officer or staff member that's going to go and run these periodic sequence of workflows. The future of where this is going for the operator is saying, hey, I want someone to help me do this targeting package or a analysis workflow. That's just a workflow that we do each day. And you can stand up and use Legion to take some of this cognitive load off your back or just some of the arduous task. The thing that's exciting for us, and as we really do think about the future, is we think the world is really transitioning into a couple new paradigms, and the DoD as well, is we will very quickly be moving from the, hey, I've tried a basic chat solution, even a gov-built one, into a world that says, I have a lot of work that I have to do each day, and we have limited resources to do huge swaths of work. How can we build workflows and agents connected to the most modern systems and the most legacy applications and the most secure environments? And that's where AI is really going to be transformational. We're leaving the demonstration and cool parlor trick phase, and it's about to change drastically, both the enterprise, commercial world, and the DoD. And we're pretty excited about where we sit in that spectrum.
You can find out more about this exciting company at warontherocks.com/Legion. Back to the show.
So my sense of it is that the statements from the Russian side continue to paint a very different picture of what was said and agreed. Even as Dara said early on in our discussion, the supposed agreement for a 1-1 presidential meeting between Putin and Zelensky, it seems the Russian version of it is they agreed to elevate the level of representation at their talks, whereas Trump thinks that Zelensky and Putin are going to meet. And then after that, they're going to have a trilat. And so I suspect, Ryan, that you're right, that Witkoff may not be fully understanding what's actually being said and agreed.
Or the wish was the father of the thought, or I don't know.
Yeah. Or there's a lot of what I see in statements is attempting to manifest things, to use a term from a younger generation, which is perhaps if they say these things enough times and if they talk enough about Russian casualties, then the incentives that don't really seem to exist for Russia and the things the Russians don't seem to have said will actually be true. But the problem I see is that you can't just manifest these things no matter how often you appear on Sunday TV talk shows. And to me, ultimately, this war is not about Donetsk. So this war is about Russia attempting to impose its will on Ukraine. And I doubt Putin will want to end it because his goal ultimately is to destroy Ukraine's viability as an independent state. And it's not about the next 30, 40 kilometers of Donetsk. That's not how the war started. And at the end of the day, who controls Donetsk isn't going to settle it either. And so I'm deeply skeptical of any settlement where people try to suggest that grand concessions have been made by Moscow, because I doubt that that's true.
I think we also have to give a lot of credit where credit is due to Zelensky and his fellow European leaders for coming to the White House and meeting with the president and communicating in the way that they did, which I think was very effective in sort of getting American policy back on course. What was your read of that day of meetings? There wasn't a lot of new information that came out about the meetings. There were some hot mic moments that leaked to the press, but they weren't really substantive.
I think it was about relationship maintenance. And so from that perspective, I think it was successful. Because if you listen to the tenor of the conversation after the summit in Alaska, there were a lot of phrases that, caught my attention. Basically, it sounded like an echo of something that President Putin said to Trump in private, and then it was coming out in these public talking points. So I think it was an effective time for the European leaders to come over and show solidarity with Ukraine at the table, to come over and show solidarity with Trump at the same time. I mean, it was not entirely a performance, but there was a great deal of performative aspect to the public-facing side of this, and I think that it went about as well as it could. And I think the timing was good. I think the timing was appropriate. But again, the details that when I look back at this is we've agreed to agree that we're all friends here. We've agreed to talk to the Russians. The Russians are not really picking up that, and they're continuing to fight. So I'm glad that we had this bonding moment. It was important. But again, the Russians are just doing what they're going to do.
It was important to keep American policy from veering off in the direction that it seemed to be with Alaska.
I agree. And again, the biggest thing for me that I'm watching is the security guarantees conversation. It's my understanding from some of the stuff in the press that the Pentagon is actively working on developing what that might look like. If we play a coordinating role, and just to unpack what I think that means from just various statements, I think that we will be providing a lot of airlift. Again, I don't know what that is above and beyond what we're doing right now. There's been some rumor in the press, I think from Besset, that we're going to charge 10% additional of the weapons that we're providing to the Europeans who will be giving it to Ukraine to cover our air costs. My comment is on what does this actually mean for the United States? It seems very clear that we're not going to have a boots-on-the-ground presence in Ukraine that will be coordinating some kind of airlift of what and to who. Are they troops moving in? What are we doing? I personally would like to see us, doing some kind of patrols to make sure that if we get to an air truce, that that's being respected.
And Russia, of course, has been quick to remind everyone that that's not what they meant by security guarantees. They didn't mean European troops in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, they brought in North Korean troops, so I guess that's on the table. So if they want to have attitude with us, I highly recommend that we remind them of that fact.
Point.
And
Good
I have
point.
lots of other suggestions for how we can remind the Russians of things. Just ask me.
I'm asking you. You have a microphone.
Okay, well, here's one. So, how did the Russians end up in Syria? By the Russians telling the legitimate government of Syria invited them to come in. Well, the Zelensky government has invited us to come in to provide some sort of air defense protection over Western Ukraine. They've invited us in for multiple reasons. So if the Russians want to have an attitude about foreign presence in Ukraine, I have two pieces of advice. Remind them of that fact. And then also, my advice for anyone considering putting boots on the ground, they will really turn up the noise on the escalation question against you. Ignore that. But if you're going to put people into Ukraine, do it quickly. Don't give them the opportunity to do anything about it. Just have them there. They're not going to do anything once you're there, but just don't have a long lead. Put them in. My 2 cents, my soapbox.
I made most of my suggestions on what a security guarantor, I guess, not guarantor, but more of a deterrence force could look like with Jack Watling when he wrote that article on War on the Rocks back in March, proposing a multinational division backed by some air power based on NATO member state territory with U.S. support and coordination initially. And thinking a multinational division would be a stretch goal for Europe, but nonetheless, it is within Europe's reach to do that if they wanted to put boots on the ground. And this has to end with some boots on the ground. I think Europeans realize that, but they're trying to do it, from my point of view, on the cheap. I think there is always a challenge in that a number of European countries want to only do it if there's some kind of ceasefire in place, and others will only want to do it if Russians want to agree to it, which they won't. And I don't think actually that much prevents us from doing this, especially if the United States is willing to offer a backstop that will provide the backbone that some European countries need in order to get on board with us.
So, as far as what's next, the White House is trying to broker face-to-face meetings between Zelensky and Putin, as we've discussed. Zelensky said, yeah, let's do it. And Putin, the Kremlin has said, oh, well, only if they come to Moscow. Different countries have said maybe they'll do it. I think the most interesting one is Hungary. Orban said he'll do it according to certain political conditions with certain sanctions being lifted against him. And that would also involve him no longer vetoing Ukraine's membership in the EU, which could be an interesting thing. But that would also require Putin agreeing to meet in the first place. What do you think happens next? Do you think this meeting ever happens, or do you think this is just sort of another round of disappointment and Trump might get back to, all right, this guy's not serious. We're going to go with the Lindsey Graham plan again?
Well, the Russians have every incentive to stall. What is compelling them to stop stalling? I think President Trump said something yesterday where he wants the timelines of this to be very short because in his mind, and I think this is a belief that he genuinely holds, he views it as every week 7,000 people are dead. And the longer we wait, that's more people who are dead. And I would encourage that impulse because the Russians are just going to try to stall for time. Let's talk about this in a month or two. Let's talk about this maybe in October after we've completed our summer offensive so we can see where we are. Holding them to some sort of shorter deadline, I think, is the right way to go. And what do you put on the table as a threat? Or if they're playing games again, I mean, I guess you walk back the US-Russia reset or development plans that were discussed. You can say, like, these are going to be jeopardized if I sense that you're wasting my time on Ukraine. You can get rough with the Russians. The Russians are very tough negotiators. I believe President Trump is a very tough negotiator as well. He understands tough people. You have to get kind of rough with the Russians. That's how you shake them off, their sort of little swagger thing they've got going on right now. That's the worst place to be in, by the way. When the Russians come to the table wearing a USSR t-shirt or sweatshirt like Lavrov did, totally bad energy from the front. No, don't do this.
Yeah, that was not a meaningless signal in terms of their attitude.
It's just a troll. It's a troll on our base, and I hope he got a very good view of a very nice military base, since that's probably a first for him.
I think the first question is there actually going to be a bilat between Zelensky and Putin? I'm very skeptical of that. I think the safe money is that probably won't happen. Second question is, when it doesn't happen, let's say it doesn't, will there then be a trilat? That I see potentially actually happening. And I think not in the necessarily classical sense.
Trump, Putin, and Zelensky.
Yeah, but it might be more like Trump meets with Putin, then he meets with Zelensky, and they do a little bit back and forth, the way they were doing with Europeans came, and then he called Putin, and then he talked to the Europeans some more.
Or like what we do with Iran.
Yep. This type of diplomacy is not uncommon. That I think actually could happen. I very much agree with you that Russians will maximize the time in between. They'll have teams negotiate this first summit, then the second one maybe, and go on from there basically to try to drag it out. Question is, what happens in between? Well, Russian offensive effort continues probably up until December, unless Ukraine's able to exhaust it sooner for this year. But I hold with my base premise from earlier podcasts that I think this war now will go into 2026. I'm still quite skeptical that anything gets resolved this year. Even after all these summits and discussions, I think Russians will pocket the win they have, which is probably going to be temporary. That is, Putin essentially has bought himself a bunch of time. With all of this, it's not clear for how long he's walked Trump off of the notion that he needs to proceed with getting a ceasefire, and he still wants a deal to end the war. So Putin has not alleviated the main source of pressure, right? He's changed the framework, at least for now, and how this is being approached, but he's not alleviated the source of pressure. And the source of pressure is that Trump wants to see this war end, and he wants to see it end as soon as possible. And he doesn't care what you call it, and he doesn't care what's the best approach. What matters to him is that he's trying to end it. And as long as that remains the case, there's going to be continued pressure on Russia one way or another. The problem is that there hasn't been much beyond rhetoric, right? We've now have two failed ultimatums. One with Europeans months ago, where they agreed to a joint ultimatum, or else they would impose sanctions on Russia, and then the U.S. bailed quickly from that when Putin proposed reviving Istanbul talks. Then a second ultimatum that we made, where the deadline keeps changing, and we bailed on that, instead had the Alaska summit.
How do things look on the battlefield today? What have been recent developments? Did Ukraine stem the Russian breakthrough?
Yeah. I mean, Russia still advanced a bit from where they were, but it's even difficult to call. Like, I was the first thing, is it more of an advance or a breach or kind of like a tactical breakthrough? It didn't develop from there. Ukraine counterattacked and actually cut off the very northern part of it. But if you look at day to day, yeah, Russian forces continue advancing in Donetsk and also a bit in north of Liman and around the Kupiansk area. So the grind continues. It's very costly for Russia in terms of casualties they're taking, but their rate of advance has continued maybe month on month through the summer, maybe staying at around 500 plus km per month.
Just on the casualties point, I do think that this is probably the most casualty intense period for the Russians. This summer and maybe starting in the spring has been horrific for them from a killed in action or irrecoverable losses standpoint. The numbers that Secretary of State Rubio is using of 20,000 or so, I think, are roughly in the ballpark. I mean, these are huge numbers, and we can react to that as Westerners and say, oh, how horrible. But just as a factor that's going to bring the Russians to the table, the Kremlin is not concerned. They haven't been. There's no pressure. There's no heat from the generals. They're not saying, I don't have enough. The Russian people are in their sort of passive acceptance of where they are right now. The casualties are not something that moves the needle to the Kremlin. We can use that as a talking point in the West amongst ourselves if we want to, but that's just not something that is going to motivate or move the Kremlin, particularly because they have a surplus of people they recruited. So even if they're breaking close to even right now on what they get every month versus what is coming off the battlefield for wounded and killed, it's okay for what they're trying to do in Donetsk. It's not stopping them. So I think there needs to be some other line of attack on the Russians because it's not casualties. This is like appealing to the stone in the Kremlin.
Yeah, just a brief comment on that. I think the challenge with the casualty conversation is when officials bring that up, what they fail to also mention is that Russian recruitment stayed on average at 33 to 35,000 per month, and that they're able to replace those losses. This year, they've had to delay new force generation. In previous years, like 24, 23, it was about a 70-30 split between maybe 70-75% for loss replacement and the rest towards expanding the force. This year, probably going to be focusing entirely on replacing the losses they've taken in combat. I know there's a recent iStories piece out there suggesting that Russia only recruited 37,000 personnel over the last quarter, and I have a lot of respect for what they do, but those numbers seem very far off to me.
Well, and there's also the sort of militias and the different state forces and the.
First of all, they're now recruiting and contracting in lots of different ways, and they're trying to pick up a lot of people who have been arrested, who have been charged with something, getting them to sign. There's a lot of folks that don't appear in those contracts, and they also lag quite a bit. So probably you'll see a big spike in Q3 of this year of people who are actually signed up, and payouts for people who actually signed up in Q2. Anyway, bottom line, what I'm saying here is that Russia's not in a place yet where they have manpower issues. Where they are, though, is that the force quality continues to go down. The people they've gotten this year are worse than the people they got last year, and the people they got last year were worse than the people they got the year before. So they can keep going like this into 2026, but force quality continues to go down. And the way they are fighting heavily constrains them towards a very cost-inefficient approach on the battlefield that yields primarily incremental
That's certainly
gains.
true, but they're, of course, on the other side facing an undermanned force. So each side has its own manpower problem, so it may just be a wash, or it still might give the Russians an advantage, certainly in terms of numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And Zelensky's own numbers recently put out show that the ratio is maybe 1 to 3, and that ratio is advantageous to Ukraine, but it's not sufficiently advantageous in terms of losses because Ukraine has far fewer people.
1 to 3 is in 3 on the Russian side,
Yeah.
1 on the Ukrainian side, and advantageous only because they're on the defensive, which means they have no offensive potential.
They're on the defensive and they have better force quality, but nonetheless, even at that rate, the reality is that the Russian force is much larger, the Russian manpower base. How much larger it is isn't as important. What's important is they're getting the numbers per month. And Ukraine, if you look at mobilization, minus monthly AWOLs and a number of other issues, simply doesn't get the same numbers.
That was a great conversation. Before we wrap up, I want to take a few moments to recognize someone who means a lot to me and to many of us who care about the profession of arms. Admiral Tony Radakin will soon retire as Chief of Defense Staff over in the UK. Throughout his career, he has shown vision, integrity, and a tireless commitment to strengthening the bonds between Britain's armed forces and its allies. He steered the United Kingdom through turbulent strategic waters and never lost sight of the human beings who wear the uniform. He was also Chief of Defense Staff throughout the entire war in Ukraine, from Russia's full-scale invasion until the present. Unfortunately, it still rages on, but I know Ukraine is better off for his leadership. Tony, thank you for your service, your leadership, and your friendship. I know you will continue to find more ways to serve and to lead. We at War on the Rocks salute you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Stay safe and stay healthy.